Grace McKellan hadn't heard the creak of the iron gate in weeks. The world outside her estate moved quickly. Gardeners came and went, delivery men left packages on the porch, and time, as always, marched on. But she remained still. Inside the vast walls of her colonial-style mansion, she lived among silence, old photographs, and the echo of memories she didn't dare to touch. That morning, she sat near the window overlooking the backyard. The pool, once a centerpiece of summer laughter, now lay under a thick film of leaves and grime. Her son used to swim there, before the accident, before everything became so quiet. She was about to turn away, when she saw him. A young man, lean and tanned from the sun, stood at the pool's edge. He adjusted a strap on his work bag, and surveyed the mess. His movements were slow, deliberate, almost thoughtful. She couldn't make out his features clearly, but something in his posture, the way he tilted his head, stopped her in her tracks. The doorbell rang minutes later. Her housekeeper, Maria, was already at the door, speaking in hushed tones. Grace stayed behind the curtain, watching. The boy's name was Alex. Maria led him to the backyard, explaining that the equipment was in the shed, that Mrs. McKellan didn't usually like to be disturbed. He nodded politely, thanked her, and got to work without complaint. Grace returned to her seat by the window. She didn't know why she couldn't look away. There was nothing extraordinary about him. A plain gray t-shirt, worn jeans, calloused hands, but as he knelt beside the filter system and brushed sweat from his brow, something stirred in her chest, a fringe ache, familiar and foreign at once. Later, as he scrubbed the tile around the pool, she found herself stepping outside. She never did that. She didn't like the sun anymore, but her feet moved as if they had a will of their own. He stood up when he noticed her, wiped his hands on a rag. He didn't speak first, just offered a quiet smile. She said, "You're doing a fine job." "Thank you, ma'am," he replied, his voice low and respectful. "What's your name?" "Alex." "Just Alex." He shrugged, still smiling. "That's all anyone's ever called me." She narrowed her eyes. There was a glint in them now, something she hadn't felt in years. She studied his face, the shape of his nose, the line of his jaw, and then his eyes, a deep green-gray, just like. She caught herself. "You remind me of someone," she said suddenly. He didn't ask who. Maybe he was used to that. Maybe people often told him he looked like someone else. Instead, he nodded once, quietly, like he understood what she meant better than she did. She asked,
"You been doing this long?"
"A couple of years, ma'am. I did construction for a while, but this pays steadier, and I like the quiet." "The quiet," she echoed. "Funny thing to like." He gave a soft chuckle. "Quiet lets you think." Grace looked past him to the still water. For the first time in months, it looked cleaner. Not perfect, but better, like something trying to be alive again. She said, "You can come back next week, same time." "Yes, ma'am. Happy to." She turned to go but paused at the steps. "Do you drink tea, Alex?" He blinked, then smiled again. "Yes, ma'am, I do." "Then maybe next time, you stay a while longer." He nodded. "I'd like that." And as she went back inside, closing the door behind her, she didn't quite understand why her hands trembled, or why her chest felt less heavy than it had in years. All she knew was that for the first time since her son's death, she looked forward to something. Or rather, to someone. Grace McKellan was not a woman of habits. Not anymore. Not since the accident. But ever since Alex started coming on Mondays, she found herself doing something she hadn't done in years. Waiting. Not nervously. Not even excitedly. Just waiting. Like someone expecting spring after a long winter. He arrived every week at the same time. His truck was old but reliable, and she could hear its engine rumble down the gravel driveway before the housekeeper even opened the gate. And every time, Grace found herself near the back terrace before he had fully set down his tools. At first she made excuses, checking if the filter was working properly, asking if the new cleaning solution was effective. But soon the questions faded. She stopped pretending she wasn't simply coming out to see him. One morning, she said, "You work with your hands but you don't move like most laborers." He looked up from where he was skimming the surface. smiled lightly. That's because I didn't grow up doing this. My grandmother used to say, the body remembers softness even when life turns it hard. Your grandmother raised you? Yes, ma'am. Since I was 4, my mom disappeared. Dad wasn't in the picture. Nana kept me alive and steady. She passed. Last year. Cancer. She held on as long as she could. I think she was waiting to make sure I'd be okay. Grace felt a familiar weight settle in her chest. That quiet pain of loss, the one that never really left but just learned to sit in the background. She asked. And now? Now I work. Save every bit I can. Try to pay for community college. I'm taking classes in mechanical engineering. But it's slow. You know, one course at a time. You don't ask for help. From who? He said with a shrug. Life's been good enough to give me 2 hands and a good head. I figure that's a fair deal. She didn't reply right away. There was a steadiness to him. Not bitterness. Not bravado. Just acceptance. Like he'd seen enough of the world to know its edges and chose not to blame it for being sharp. Later that day, as he finished brushing the last tile, she stood at the porch holding a tray. I made tea. You said you liked it. He wiped his hands, walked over and sat across from her on the shaded bench. The cups were porcelain, delicate and old. She hadn't used them in years. They clinked gently as he picked his up. This is real nice, he said. It's just tea. No. It's more than that. Most people wouldn't offer. They drank mostly in silence that first afternoon. But it was a comfortable kind of silence. One with room for breath. Grace noticed things. How he always looked people in the eye when they spoke. How he listened more than he talked. How he sometimes smiled to himself. Like he remembered something no one else did. The next week, she didn't wait for him to finish. She came out as he was setting up. I've been reading again, she said. Poetry. He glanced at her a little surprised. What kind? Old things. Byron. Dickinson. The kind people don't teach anymore. My Nana used to read Frost. She loved that line. What was it? Something about the road not taken. Grace nodded. And that has made all the difference. That afternoon, they sat longer. He asked about her books. She asked about his classes. He told her about a professor who reminded him of his grandmother, sharp-tongued but kind. She told him about her garden, and how the roses used to bloom like fire before she gave up tending them. As the days turned into weeks, the conversations grew. She found herself laughing, really laughing when he described trying to fix his truck using YouTube tutorials and duct tape. He told her about the night his grandmother taught him to dance using the living room as a ballroom and an old jazz record. They never touched the subject of her son. She never mentioned his name. But sometimes, when Alex looked up at her with that same quiet strength, she wondered if the universe was sending her a mercy she didn't deserve. Her family didn't know. Her daughter Elise called once a week, usually to check if Grace was still taking her blood pressure pills. Her nephew visited only on holidays, always in a hurry, always talking about real estate and market value. But here, in her own backyard, something sacred was building, a space that didn't ask for permission. A space where 2 people from different worlds met in the middle, and every time Alex stood to leave, he would say, "Thank you for the tea, ma'am," and she would answer, "Come again next week. I'll be here," and somehow that simple exchange made her feel more alive than she had in years. It was a Thursday afternoon when Grace invited Alex inside. The clouds were thick, and the sky had begun to grumble softly in the distance. She insisted. It wasn't right for him to be working with a storm approaching. He hesitated for a moment at the threshold of the grand old house, his boots leaving faint smudges on the marble floor. She waved off his apology before it left his lips. "Come, sit down. I'll make that cinnamon tea you liked." He followed her into the sitting room, a warm space with bookshelves that stretched to the ceiling, soft rugs, and a fireplace that hadn't been used in a year. The walls were covered with paintings, landscapes, mostly, but near the mantel was a small frame, old and silver-edged, with a photograph inside. He didn't notice it at first, but she did. As he sat on the couch and took the tea with his usual quiet gratitude, she stood near the mantel for a long moment. Then slowly, she picked up the frame. "I want to show you something," she said. "This was my son." She walked over and placed the photograph gently in his hands. The picture was faded, but the young man in it was clear. Tan skin, sharp cheekbones, dark intelligent eyes, and a slight smirk that suggested he didn't take life too seriously. He looked about 20. Grace watched Alex's expression carefully. He blinked, and then looked again. "That's strange," he said quietly. "You see it too?" "Yeah. He looks like me." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the ticking of the old clock on the wall. Grace sat down across from him, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "You really don't know anything about your father?" she asked. Softer now. He shook his head. "No name. My mom never talked about him. Nana once said she thought he was someone my mom met during her troubled years. But even she didn't know more." "Did your mother grow up around here?" "I think she was born in California. But we moved a lot." I never asked too many questions. She wasn't stable. Nana said it was better not to dig too deep. Grace's heart was beating a little too fast. She tried to keep her face calm, but something inside her was shifting, pulling, opening an old door she thought was sealed forever. She took back the photo, held it in her lap. Her eyes stayed on the face of the boy in the frame. Her son Daniel. He had died nearly 20 years ago. At 26, in a car crash that shattered her world. His girlfriend at the time had disappeared soon after. Grace never knew her name. She was just gone. She remembered that girl had been troubled. Daniel had met her during his time away at college. He'd said she had demons. Grace never pressed. She had thought it was just another phase. But now, looking at Alex, the sharpness of the jaw, the intensity of the gaze, even the way he rubbed the back of his neck when nervous, it was uncanny. She didn't say what was rising in her throat. She didn't ask the questions. Not yet. Instead she smiled gently and said, "You remind me of him. More than just looks." Alex looked down. "That's an honor. I'm sorry you lost him." She nodded. Her voice was still calm when she replied, "You know, sometimes I think the people we lose, they never really leave. They just return in ways we least expect." Alex glanced up at her, unsure of how to respond. So he didn't. He just held her gaze and offered the kind of silence that meant he understood something, even if not everything. That day, he stayed longer than usual. They spoke less, but the space between them had changed. Deeper now, quieter, like something important had passed through. When he finally left, she stood at the window and watched him walk down the driveway. For the first time in years, her heart didn't ache from absence. It thudded with something new. Not certainty, not yet, but possibility. That night, she sat at her desk, pulled open an old drawer, and took out a box filled with fragments of Daniel's life, letters, photos, school certificates. At the bottom was a single torn photograph of Daniel and the girl, her face barely visible, arm hooked in his. Grace stared at it for a long time, trying to remember what she had once dismissed. If Alex was her grandson, if life had in some impossible way returned a piece of her child, what then? She didn't know, but for the first time in years, she wanted to. Grace didn't sleep much that night. Something inside her had clicked into place after the conversation with Alex. A quiet certainty she hadn't felt in years. By morning, her mind was made up. She called her attorney Richard Bell, a stern man in his 60s who had handled her affairs for over 2 decades. "I need to update my will," she said plainly. Richard was surprised. "Is something wrong?" "No, Richard. Something is finally right." He came to the house the next morning. They sat in the study, the drapes open wide to let in the soft golden light. Grace handed him a slip of paper with a name and instructions. Her house, her estate, and everything not already assigned to charity. All of it. She wanted to go to Alex. Richard hesitated. You understand what this will do to your family, Grace? I do, she replied, her voice steady. I've given them everything they ever asked for. And in return, they've given me distance, demands and disdain. Alex. He gave me peace. And he never asked for a thing. Richard studied her for a long moment, then nodded. Very well. By Friday, the documents were signed. Grace didn't tell Alex. Not yet. She wanted the moment to be right. Perhaps next week. Over tea, in that quiet garden, where they had shared so many silences that meant more than words. But fate had other plans. That Sunday, her family arrived for what had become an obligatory monthly tradition, the McKellan Sunday lunch. Her nephew Charles, his wife Linda, and their daughter Clara pulled up in matching black SUVs, all polished sunglasses and shallow smiles. They hadn't been inside the house for 2 minutes before Charles was already complaining about the lack of wine. Grace, as usual, smiled and nodded. But her eyes kept drifting to the backyard, where Alex was skimming the surface of the pool, earbuds in, humming softly to himself. Who's that? Clara asked, peeking through the glass doors. Oh, the new gardener, Linda said dismissively. No, he's the pool cleaner, Charles corrected, then chuckled. Looks like Grace is really downsizing the staff. Clara giggled. He looks like he sleeps in the tool shed. Enough, Grace said sharply. They turned to her, surprised. Her voice had an edge they hadn't heard in years. His name is Alex. And he is my guest. Treat him with respect. Or leave. There was a beat of silence. Charles raised an eyebrow. Come on, Aunt Grace. You can't be serious. I am deadly serious, she replied. And I will not tolerate arrogance in this house anymore. Clara muttered something under her breath. Linda shot her a warning look. Charles, too stunned to argue, poured himself a glass of water and sat down in silence. The lunch was quiet after that. Grace didn't invite Alex in, but he stayed near the back garden, and once or twice, she caught his eye through the window. There was concern there. He had heard something. She gave him a small nod. Everything was fine. Or so she hoped. The following week, on a cool Wednesday morning, Grace didn't come down for breakfast. It was her housekeeper, Mura, who found her. Grace lay in her bed, her hands folded gently over her chest, the covers still smooth. There was no sign of struggle, no sign of fear, just a quiet passing, like a candle fading after the final flicker. The news traveled quickly. Richard was notified. And within a day, the family circled like birds sensing a storm. Charles called 3 times demanding answers. Linda asked if the antiques would be appraised. Clara posted an old picture of Grace on social media with a heart emoji and the caption, "R.I.P. to a Queen." Alex didn't speak to anyone. He returned to the house and sat on the back porch for hours, staring at the rippling water in the pool. His hands trembled when he finally removed the skimmer and locked it away for good. 3 days later, they all gathered in Richard's office. The family sat on one side. Charles, arms crossed. Linda tapping her manicured nails on her phone. Clara, chewing gum. Alex sat near the back, quiet, dressed plainly in a black shirt. He didn't know why he had been asked to attend. Richard entered the room and cleared his throat. I'll get straight to it. This is the last will and testament of Grace Eleanor McKellan, updated and signed 7 days ago. He looked around. No one interrupted. To my family, I leave what I believe they truly earned. My memories, my silence, and the knowledge that they were never strangers to my heart, but never quite friends to my soul. Clara let out a quiet laugh. Charles shot her a look. To my charities, I leave the donations already arranged and filed in Appendix B, and to Alexander James Carter, I leave my home, my land, and all contents therein. Because what is inherited in blood can still be earned in spirit, and his spirit is worthy. The silence that followed was explosive. Charles stood up so quickly his chair fell backward. You're joking, he barked. She gave it to the gardener? He is not a gardener, Richard said calmly. And I assure you, she was of sound mind. She was manipulated. Linda added. That boy took advantage of her loneliness. Alex looked down, face still. She was not lonely, Richard said. She was finally at peace, and no one has the right to strip her of the one decision that truly belonged to her. Outside thunder rolled. And just like that, the storm began. The news of the will spread like wildfire, igniting a fierce battle that no one saw coming. Grace's family was stunned beyond belief. How could she leave everything to a pool cleaner, someone they barely knew? Charles was the first to act, gathering lawyers and filing a lawsuit to contest the will. They accused Alex of manipulation, fraud, even conspiracy. Courtroom doors opened and closed for weeks. The once quiet estate turned into a battleground where memories clashed like thunder. Grace's relatives portrayed her as a confused, feeble-minded old woman, easily swayed by the boy who reminded her too much of the son she lost. But Richard Bell, Grace's longtime attorney, was prepared. When the opposition claimed Grace was no longer competent, Richard presented stacks of handwritten letters and journals, some dating back years. They were meticulous, filled with Grace's elegant cursive and raw honesty. In one entry, Grace described her days after her son's death, the endless loneliness that wrapped around her like a cold blanket. In another, she wrote about Alex, how his presence had reawakened something inside her, how he was the only person who had ever truly listened without judgment. Her words were clear. This was not the whim of a lost old woman. This was a decision made from the depths of her heart. The courtroom fell silent when Richard read aloud a letter where Grace spoke directly to Alex. She called him her unexpected blessing, a second chance at family and hope, but the family wasn't ready to give up. Charles stood at the front of the room and demanded a DNA test. How could it be possible? He challenged. Alex isn't even related to her. This is a cheap trick to win the inheritance. The judge looked thoughtful. There was a quiet murmur in the room. After a pause, the judge nodded and said, "We will proceed with the test. If there is a possibility that Alex is related to Ms. McKellan's late son, we must know the truth." Alex's face remained calm, but his heart raced. He had never considered this before, the idea that he might be family, raised by his grandmother, with little knowledge about his father or mother. He had always felt like an outsider, drifting in search of belonging. The days leading up to the test were tense. The media caught wind of the story, painting Alex alternately as a victim or a schemer, depending on the outlet. Grace's family watched closely, their confidence wavering with every headline. When the results finally arrived, the courtroom was packed. Everyone held their breath as the judge opened the envelope. The judge cleared his throat. The DNA test confirms a close familial relationship between Alexander James Carter and the late Thomas McKellan, son of Grace McKellan. Gasps filled the room. Charles looked pale, mouth opening and closing without sound. Media pressed her hand to her chest. Clara's eyes filled with tears. Alex's lips trembled. After years of searching for answers, he finally had one. He was not just a stranger with a familiar face, he was family. The missing piece of a puzzle he never knew he was trying to solve. Richard stepped forward. This changes everything. Alex is not only the rightful heir to Grace's estate, but also her grandson. It is a bond forged in blood and memory. The courtroom erupted with whispers and questions. The story had turned from a bitter legal battle into a revelation that would shake the McKellan legacy forever. Outside, the sky cleared, and sunlight spilled through the courthouse windows. For Alex, it was the beginning of a new chapter, one filled with answers, healing and the promise of a family finally reunited. The revelation from the DNA test marked a turning point not just for Alex but for everyone who had followed the story. The court confirmed what many had suspected, but none had dared to say aloud. Alex was the grandson of Grace McKellan. Her late son Thomas had once shared a brief secret romance with a woman Grace never knew about. From that union, Alex was born, a truth hidden by time and circumstance until now. In the quiet hours following the verdict, Richard Bell handed Alex a sealed envelope. Inside was a small USB drive labeled simply with Grace's handwriting, for Alex. Alex sat alone in the now empty estate, the walls echoing with memories and unresolved questions. He hesitated before pressing play on the old laptop. The screen flickered to life, revealing Grace herself. Her voice, though frail, carried warmth and conviction. She began by saying she never believed in coincidences. That life had a way of weaving threads together in ways we often cannot understand until the right moment arrives. She spoke of loneliness, loss, and the unexpected gift that had entered her life the day Alex arrived to clean her pool. Grace's eyes searched the camera as if speaking directly to Alex. She said, "Family is not only about blood, but about the silences shared between souls. Those quiet moments where understanding needs no words." She told him how much joy he had brought into her life, how his kindness had healed old wounds she thought would never close. Her final words were a wish for him to live fully, to honor the past without being bound by it, and to build a future brighter than anyone could have imagined. Tears streamed down Alex's face as he watched the video. It was a gift of love and closure he had never expected to receive. With the estate now his, Alex faced a decision. The house, grand and filled with history, was a symbol of a family divided. After much thought, he chose not to keep it for himself. Instead, he decided to sell the property. The proceeds became the seed money for a foundation Alex founded, the Grace McKellan Fund, dedicated to helping lonely and forgotten elderly people find companionship, care, and dignity. He wanted to ensure that no one would feel as isolated as Grace once had. Word of the foundation spread quickly, and soon Alex was surrounded by a new kind of family: volunteers, supporters, and the very people his grandmother had longed to protect. His journey from a quiet pool cleaner to a man connected by blood, history, and purpose was complete. In the end, Alex learned that family could be found in unexpected places, that love could mend even the deepest wounds, and that sometimes, life's most profound truths come wrapped in the most unlikely packages. And so, beneath the wide open sky of the estate's garden, Alex stood looking toward the horizon, ready to embrace the future with open arms. A future shaped by the past, but not defined by it.